Hello, everyone, and welcome to an American Legislative Exchange Council live stream. ALEC, I'm Catherine Mortensen. I'm joined by Lee Schock, who is our Vice President of Policy, and Jonathan Williams, who is our Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy. Thank you all for being with us today. We want to just get right into this. Today, we released our 15th annual Rich States, Poor States. This is our ranking of states by economic competitiveness. The authors of it are Dr. Arthur Laffer. He's a Reagan economist. We also have Stephen Moore, an economist with FreedomWorks, and our own Jonathan Williams was a co-author on that report. So thank you all for joining us. And Jonathan, why don't we just start by asking you if there was a theme to all of the data you collected this year, and there is a lot of data here. Is there sort of an overall narrative, a theme that came out of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And happy tax day, everybody. We release this every year. This is the 15th edition of Rich States, Poor States. And, the theme, as we kept this ranking similar over now 15 years of data, where these are 15 factors such as taxes and labor policy and regulation that we know matter for the future of states. We know that they're generally very correlated with the economic health, with immigration, as people continue to vote with their feet. We know that based on, I know all of you as legislators have been working on your new maps and redistricting, but where did people go from? Where did they go to? They're leaving high tax states in droves like California and Illinois and New York. They're going to Texas and Florida and states that value economic freedom. And so Rich States, Poor States goes through the data now 15 years of showing why people are leaving high tax states and going to low tax states, and what are those policy levers that matter the most: tax rates, tax burdens, regulatory burdens, things like labor policy. Is your state a right to work state or not? What kind of minimum wage laws do you have? And then just as importantly, because we know there's so many of these different ranking systems out there these days, but ours is so important in that we know these variables matter for economic growth. But just as importantly, there are things that you as state legislators directly control. So in a given session, you could change your tax rates, change your regulatory regime, change your labor policies. And in a short amount of time, we've seen, as we're going to talk about today, a whole lot of states move dramatically in the right direction over 15 years, and a few that have dramatically moved in the wrong direction. So there's a lot of room for movement in these rankings.
And I'm sure everyone watching wants to know, well, what are the rankings? How did the states work out this year? So I'm just going to put that on the bottom of the screen, and we'll ask Lee, what are the top best run states in our rankings?
Yeah. Big news this year. Utah took the number one spot again, 15 years running in Rich States, Poor States, followed by North Carolina at number 2, their all-time best ranking in our report, Arizona at 3, Oklahoma at 4, and Idaho at 5. But I think that there are a couple common themes we see here with some of our top states. Obviously, Utah, they have a flat income tax. It's not a progressive system. They've actually got a property tax burden that they've kept in check thanks to things like truth in taxation, which is now an ALEC model policy. But North Carolina is actually a huge success story in this year's report. If you go back to 2011, North Carolina was actually ranked 26th, so right in the middle of the pack. But thanks to major pro-growth tax reforms over the last decade, North Carolina has really jumped in the report and really improved their economic outlook and competitiveness. And they've done so by taking a progressive income tax system, getting that flat tax rate, but also having lower rates on both the corporate and personal side of the income tax code. And it's really paid off for the old North state.
And I would say, if I'm not mistaken, North Carolina currently has a Democrat as governor. Am I right? So just to sort of illustrate that these rankings are not sort of a partisan issue. We look at everyone regardless of political affiliation.
Well, of course, it's a nonpartisan report, and you'll see a mix of legislatures and governors, different leadership in the states. But of course, regardless of whether it's a red state governor or a blue state governor, you've got all types of progress that can be made. You may have a legislature that sends a bill to a governor's desk, like in the case of North Carolina. The legislature sent Governor Roy Cooper a budget that included a complete phase out of taxes on business income, as well as an expansion of school choice, things that are really strong ALEC policies, and that was ultimately signed into law. And so you can see how leaders in states have to work together on things like that.
Yeah. So, okay, you got that. Number one, Utah for the past 15 years in a row. Congratulations to Utah. And now we're going to look at the bottom 5, the worst run states in the country. And I'm guessing it's going to be the usual suspects. So,
and you would be correct. As many of the good stories there at the top of the index, as Lee was talking about, and there we could spend a whole live stream just talking about Utah, North Carolina, and Arizona as the top 3. Unfortunately, not all is good news in the report, as there have to be a bottom of the report, and there will not be a lot of surprises for those of you that follow state policy making. 50th out of 50 is once again the state of New York, which has been in nearly 50th every single edition. I think they moved up once or twice to 49th. And then they're followed by New Jersey, which is their worst all-time ranking at 49th this year under Phil Murphy as governor. As we pointed out in our recent governor's report, they were one of the only states in New Jersey to enact a massive tax increase in the middle of the pandemic on small businesses and individual income earners. California, also not a big surprise, in the bottom 3 at 48, their worst ranking ever as a state, as Gavin Newsom looks to continually spend more money and raise taxes. And then Vermont and Minnesota round out the bottom 5. And as good as the good news is, these states at the bottom, I think, follow what Reagan always correctly described as, the liberal view of the economy can be summed up as this. And this is the approach of the bottom 5 states. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. And if that's the governance theme, which it is, it's high taxes across the board in these states, and then special government winners and losers based on who's best connected in those state capitals and has the best lobbyists. Of course, that is the way not to do business, and that's going to come back to hurt those states greatly over time.
Jerry Arthur from Texas. No, I'm sorry. He's asking us, where is Texas in the rankings? So thank you for watching, Jerry. We're happy to have you here.
Just outside of the top 10, just barely missed it at number 11 this year for economic outlook. And look, Texas is a great economic success story in so many ways. They get the big things right, such as avoiding a personal income tax, being a right to work state. So many of those policy levers that are, I think, the most essential out of the 15 that we measure. However, as I'm guessing a resident of Texas and a property tax owner in Texas, that property taxes are too high right now. And several other factors do weigh down Texas's ranking. It's something I know it's on the agenda in Austin as they come back into session next year with Governor Abbott and our ALEC legislative leaders. So stay tuned. We'll be working with them to hopefully reduce property tax burdens in Texas and get Texas back into the top 10.
And Lee, you mentioned this a little bit earlier about North Carolina being the big mover in these rankings. Yeah. Are there any other states that saw significant upward movement?
Yeah, we actually saw Idaho go from number 10 to number 5 in this year's report. They continue to chip away at their high income tax rates. States like Ohio, now at number 19. If you go back to our first edition, they were actually ranked 47th. And last year, they were 28th. So thanks to tax cuts in 2021, Ohio is moving in the right direction. And then West Virginia is another state to keep an eye on. They're right in the middle of the pack this year at 25, but there's good things happening in West Virginia, and they're trending in the right direction in terms of economic outlook.
Yeah, West Virginia was actually one of those states where last year Governor Justice and a lot of our ALEC legislators in the Senate there were looking at ways to repeal the personal income tax altogether in West Virginia. Obviously, one of the key takeaways from our report is that all taxes matter, but income taxes are the most damaging. And anybody that's working on your last minute tax filing today, you know exactly what I'm talking about, of how complex income taxes can be. And it's great news that so many states are looking to either flatten their income tax or eliminate it altogether. And that's actually one of the really cool stories in the last month or so in the States. We've seen really the flat tax revolution take off, whether it's Georgia, whether it's Mississippi, whether it's Arizona, whether it's Iowa. We've seen 4 states in the last month or so become flat tax states, which for those history buffs on the live stream today, in the history of state income taxes, I believe in 110 years, we've seen a grand total of 4 states go from a progressive income tax to a flat tax. In the last 4 weeks, we've seen 4 more states go to a flat tax. So that's something we can all be cheerful of this year.
And what about Tennessee? Amber Niblock, she's actually a friend of mine. So hello, Amber. Welcome to the show. That's your home state. How did Tennessee do this year?
Yes, Tennessee's at number 13 in the report. They also do not have a personal income tax. They phased out their Hall tax on dividend and interest income, which kind of removed that asterisk on the income tax to make them completely no income, one of the 9 states. They also have a form of truth in taxation, which they benefit from on property taxes.
And some of the hat tip from the flat tax states that we were just talking about in Mississippi and in Georgia specifically, I think the pressure that Tennessee and Florida and Texas is no income tax states in the Southeast region really put on those states, being in those state capitals. That's a big deal when you have to compete against zero in a state like Tennessee and Texas and Florida. Why we've seen those other states get so aggressive in cutting income taxes.
And the thing that you talked about at the very beginning, which is really sort of the theme of this report, is these states that are performing well are attracting more people. And I certainly know that to be the case for Tennessee. I mean, that is a hot, hot state. People are moving to Tennessee, Idaho, Utah, all those sort of low-income, well-run states are really seeing the benefits. So I just don't understand why these poorly run states aren't getting the message. I mean, to me, it's so clear.
I wish I bought a lot of homes in Nashville or
Right?
Salt Lake City or Boise in recent years, because those real estate markets are booming, especially pre-interest rates going up recently with the Biden inflation that the Fed is trying to correct. But I mean, that being said, it's really interesting because the proof is in the pudding, and that states that do well in this report are inbound migration states.
Yep.
Utah, number one, and for 15 years running.
Mm-hmm.
Guess which state was the number one state for population growth for the last decade in the United States? It was Utah.
Yeah.
And Idaho was number 2. So we saw some great correlation there. And the question is why the progressive states don't figure that out? That's a really good question. It's a really good question. And I think part of that is they're so dyed in the wool of their left-wing progressive ideologies in these states that they would rather worry about redistributing income than worry about economic growth. And I think that's fundamentally, where they're coming from.
Of course, Texas is another state that's had a huge influx of new residents. There was new Census Bureau data that came out during the height of the pandemic between June 2020 and June 2021. 600,000 new residents in the state of Texas. I would say that a lot of those people moving there are doing so because of opportunity.
Yeah, that's another big theme that we're talking about here at ALEC is the opportunity. That's what we are trying to promote. Speaking of opportunity, we have a great opportunity in the next year or two to urge Congress to keep in place what I call the Trump tax cuts, but they actually have a formal name. What is the formal name of these Trump tax cuts? I benefited because I remember I looked at my pay stub that when they first went into effect, I was like, wow, that's some real money. They're set to phase out, though, at the end of 2025.
That's right. Yeah, and that's something that all of you probably benefited because the vast majority of Americans benefited from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 that President Trump signed into law. If you remember the news coverage of the major companies giving raises and bonuses around Christmas time because they received the business side tax relief, but it was a huge tax cut on the individual side of income as well. Small businesses, lower rates. We saw the great repeal and rollback of the hated alternative minimum tax, the AMT, that was encroaching on so many middle-income taxpayers across the country. And then we saw things like the SALT deduction. That was something that we at ALEC spent a lot of time talking about in those years, which was that's the subsidy to high tax states that was in the federal tax code. It was unlimited, and now President Trump's tax reform capped that at $10,000 annually, putting an end to the unlimited ability to write off high state and local taxes. The point is we're not looking to protect high state and local taxes. Look at this index. We don't favor that approach. What we look at, though, is folks in those state capitals need to be training that really dissatisfaction with their state government to the individuals, let's say in Albany or Springfield or Sacramento, and not looking for the rest of the American taxpayers to pick up the tab for those states' decisions.
That's exactly right. So anything else? I mean, how significant were the Trump tax cuts, Lee? I mean, I know, like I said, I saw a real impact in my pay stub, but I mean, what was $6,000 is what the median family kept that year? Or?
Yeah, median income was going up right after the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And of course, before the government mandated lockdowns of the pandemic, the economy was just humming along. And we saw so many employers giving out bonuses. Unemployment had reached record lows. But it's so important that we are able to extend these 23 provisions that relate directly to individual income taxes. It's so important that we extend those and make them permanent. You contrast that with what's happening in Washington right now, and just with our economy, record inflation. We just saw the new numbers last week. Unemployment is still too high. We're seeing a war on American energy independence. Of course, gas prices are at record highs. And what's the response from Washington and even the Biden administration? It's proposals to do things like raise income tax rates, to take our business income taxes higher than the rates imposed by communist China, of all places. And so there really is, I think, an opportunity here for state lawmakers to speak up in favor of extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But it's so important right now. It's such a stark contrast with what we're seeing happening here in DC.
Absolutely. And in fact, you just said something about state lawmakers. I've heard our CEO, Lisa Nelson, talk about state lawmakers are the lawmakers closest to the people. They know, they get it. They hear from their constituents about how tough things are. So I think this is a perfect opportunity for those state lawmakers to send a message to Washington, because it feels like so often Washington is just really out of touch. Like you say, the land of make-believe.
Land of make-believe.
Like they're not in touch with what's happening in rural Tucson, Arizona, or, Canyon City, Colorado, where I lived at one time. So I think this is an opportunity at the state level to make that message very clear.
And one thing on that point, Kat, is a lot of people didn't follow this in the weeds as much, but when it comes to that federal tax reform, provisions that were on the corporate side, and those are important provisions, as Lee was talking about, that got the U.S. back to average versus being the highest business taxes in the world, higher than communist China. Those were permanent. What's not permanent is the individual side relief. So the vast majority of the tax cuts, as we know, small businesses were a huge recipient of those. Middle and low income workers were a huge recipient of those on the individual side. That's the piece that we're fighting for in terms of educating on this issue. And that's something that, if anything right now, small businesses can't be hit by a double whammy of kind of this Biden presiding over the economy with inflation and just everything that's going on right now, and then the uncertainty about will their taxes go up if Congress does nothing to extend these tax cuts.
I want to close out here with a quote, and this is from our good friend and author of this study, Stephen Moore. Give me a moment and I'll pull that up. And then I want you to react to that, Lee and Jonathan, and just kind of tell me where we're at. Stephen Moore said, "It's a magic moment for tax reform at the state level. I think even in some of these blue states that have been traditionally very liberal, they're looking at some reforms that could really make their states more prosperous." Do you want to comment on that, Lee?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Jonathan said earlier. We're having, and like Steve has said, we really are having a magic moment. We've seen those 4 states go to a flat tax just in the last couple of weeks. And so that it really is a special time for tax reform. Of course, a lot of states have lots and lots of extra money in their budgets right now, thanks to kind of the influx of funds that came out of Washington during the pandemic. And we have seen a lot of blue states come to the table and try to figure out ways to provide relief. But we're always going to point to meaningful, pro-growth, and permanent tax reform as being the best solution for the states.
Yeah, there's no doubt that Steve's right on that point. We've seen it with school choice. Last year, our board member, Patricia Rucker in West Virginia, led with the Hope Scholarship Program that's become, I think, a model nationally. We're seeing states across the country take up that effort. And on taxes, there's no doubt. I mean, if you are a free market state legislator right now, with all this federal money sloshing around the state budgets, we're hearing this all the time from appropriations and budget committee folks, which is really terrifying, which is we've got so much money sitting there right now, we don't know how to spend it all. So this is the perfect time to get it back to hardworking taxpayers, to small businesses, and to make sure that it's not used to grow government permanently, where you're setting levels of spending at an unsustainable level, because we know these times aren't going to last forever, and we know that this is going to end, and we want to make sure that states aren't putting themselves in a position where they're facing deficits and they're coming back to look to raise taxes in future years.
And do you know they will?
They will, at least in the bottom 10 states.
Yeah, at least in the bottom 10
states.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that, Lee, that we need to touch upon before we close out? Or?
Yeah, I would just I would direct everyone to check out richstatespoorstates.org. Check out how your state stacks up. You can compare your state's policies against any other state in the country. And you can even hit our Adjust Policies tool to see how, let's say, lower tax rates might affect your state's ranking.
Okay, I'm going to try to put that up on the screen. And Jonathan, anything you want to, rich states, poor states.org.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a treasure trove of information here. So if you're a data geek like we are, at least Lee and I are, spend some time with it. We've got all 15 editions of richstatespoorstates.org loaded in, so you can track the progress. So like we're sitting here in Virginia. Virginia, for instance, 10 years ago, I was at the Richmond State Capitol with then Speaker Bill Howell announcing Virginia ranked number 3 in Rich States, Poor States. Today, they've fallen all the way to 24. One of the biggest loser in the 15 years of our report. And you can track that kind of movement. You can look at the biggest winners, like Lee pointed out, with Ohio and North Carolina and others moving up over time. And we also have the ability, I would call our Adjust Policies tool and the website, to say, if you're filing a proposal in your state, if you're a legislator and you're looking to propose something, how would your bill affect your state's Rich States, Poor States ranking? You can click that button after making the adjustments and see right before your eyes how it would change your ranking for potentially next year. So, for instance, in Arizona, we were working with Senator Vince Leach and President Karen Fann, our ALEC board chairman this year. We were looking at ways that they were looking to cut taxes last year. And they said, what would our tax bill do to our Rich States, Poor States ranking? We ran that calculation. We said it would move from 13 to 3. Well, guess what? It actually did. Arizona's at number 3 this year. They've improved 10 spots. And that's the kind of thing that we can provide going forward.
So this is literally in real time, that sort of the 50 laboratories of democracy, as you see these states competing with one another to get that higher ranking.
Exactly. And I think one takeaway message always from this is, you can easily as a state fall behind by standing still, because there's so many states moving in the right direction that in this competitive environment, you really have to be continually foot on the gas and moving in the correct direction. Otherwise, you run into the situation like Virginia, which didn't make all that many big policy mistakes. And yet, as North Carolina's gone from 26 to 2, Virginia's gone from 3 now down to 24. So how about that for bordering states moving in different directions?
Thank you very much. It's just so refreshing to hear some good things happening in terms of limited government and federalism and lower taxes, because we're definitely not getting it out of Washington. So kudos to all the states out there that are doing good things. We are just grateful for you and grateful for all of you who joined us today. And we'll see you next time on another ALEC live stream.